Hi, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the final Fall Speaker Series event from the Berkman Klein Center's Institute for Rebooting Social Media. Through the series, we've been able to explore ideas that examine our current online ecosystems in the hopes of sparking constructive conversations. We believe this sort of critical engagement leads to meaningful improvements in our digital lives. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to thank you all for your presence and participation through the series over the last few months. Now, I'm pleased to welcome the Applied Social Media Lab's Senior Director, Jonathan Belek, to introduce today's guest. Jonathan is a veteran internet technology product manager with over 30 years of experience, starting with dot-com era startups in New York City, Silicon Valley, and the UK. In 2018, Jonathan became the first ever product management director at Jigsaw, which is a Google unit building experimental technology to combat digital harms, including organized harassment, repressive censorship, and state-sponsored disinformation. He joined the Applied Social Media Lab at the beginning of this year and has since built a team of about 20 technologists working on social media approaches in the public interest. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jonathan Belek.
Thank you very much, Shelby. I want to get out of the way as quickly as possible, so I'm going to introduce a little bit about Johan's background and talk a little bit about how I came across his work and then hand it off. Johan Farkas is an assistant professor in media studies at the University of Copenhagen. His research explores the intersection of digital media, journalism, disinformation, and democracy. And he has been in the past a visiting researcher at Cornell University, chair of the Young Scholars Network of the European Communication Research and Education Association, and a speaker at many institutions, and I'm grateful that he's now here with us. I came across Johan's work back when the first edition of his book came out in 2020, when I was leading product management at the Jigsaw unit of Google. At the time, there was a lot of energy around the question of how do we stop misinformation? How do we solve the disinformation problem? What's the silver bullet that's going to make it all better? And I, coming out of industry, wanted to learn more about, well, have academics looked at this? Is there anything that people have figured out that a big company could implement? And found Johan's book and found it brilliant, complex, and very sobering of how questions of truth and questions of democracy do and do not interact well. I have offered other people to read this book many times over the past 4 years, and have not been very good at explaining the argument on Johan's behalf. So I'm very grateful that he is here to walk you all through it himself. And I'm really excited to be able to introduce him. I'm going to hand it off to Johan, who's going to present, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions towards the end of the session. So Johan, thank you very much, and take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. So I will start by briefly taking us back quite a bit more than 200 years, because I want to open with Friday the 13th in December 1799, when George Washington, the first president of the United States of America, woke up with a sore throat. The previous day, Washington had been out in the fields where he had gotten himself wet and cold from the rain and snow. Despite the sore throat, Washington ventured back into the snow that day with a group of enslaved workers, picking out trees on his plantation for them to cut down. But throughout the day, his pain intensified. 2 years prior, George Washington had ended his second term as President of the United States, retiring to his estate to oversee his plantations. Washington was still, however, politically active and had, for example, vocally supported the so-called Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. The Sedition Act made it illegal to print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing about the government of the United States. Even before this law was enacted, it was heavily criticized for undermining freedom of speech, which had just been secured through the First Amendment. Thomas Jefferson famously opposed the law and would later, during his presidency, pardon citizens and news publishers who had been convicted under it. But on this day in 1799, George Washington still had a sore throat, and that night he woke up with more pain as well as difficulties breathing. A doctor was called, and while waiting for him, George Washington asked to have some of his blood extracted from his body. This was a common treatment at the time and one favored by Washington. When the doctor finally arrived, a second bloodletting was performed. This, however, did not help. Another doctor was called and more blood was extracted. A third doctor was called and more blood was extracted a fourth and final time. At that point, it is estimated that George Washington had lost roughly 40% of his total blood volume. And that night, famously, George Washington died at the age of 67. So, I'm opening my talk today with this anecdote because I think there are several lessons we can learn from it and bring into the discussion we will be having today. First, and perhaps most obviously, this anecdote reminds us that medical science has come a long way since 1799. Both political leaders and doctors used to understand the world quite differently from us, and these worldviews, which used to be both dominant and even commonsensical, now often appear both bizarre and alien in the rearview mirror of history. Second, the story reminds us that what has historically been seen as cures or remedies for ailments or problems have in some instances only made matters worse. This might be easy to see in hindsight, but it is not always easy to see for those involved. Third, the anecdote also reminds us that struggles over freedom of speech have a long and complex history in what we now call liberal democracies. And it reminds us of how restrictions on free speech have often been legitimized through fears of false or scandalous claims or news. So I'm bringing all this up today, not because I want to give a history lesson on George Washington, but because I want to talk about contemporary struggles over democracy. And I want to talk about a threat that is often directly compared to a disease, plague, or virus, threatening not only public health, but also the very foundation and existence of liberal democracies. It is often portrayed as something that needs to be eradicated if democracy is to survive. This threat goes by many names: fake news, junk news, misinformation, disinformation, the infodemic, the post-truth era, the post-factual condition. All of this is what I would like to talk about today. So I will share my screen and then talk a bit about our book, which is the background for why I'm presenting for you guys today. So, as Jonathan mentioned, me and my dear friend and co-author Jannik Skov wrote this book, Post-Truth, Fake News and Democracy, in 2018, 2019, and we then got a chance to update it in a second edition, which came out a year ago. In this book, we try to take what we call post-truth worlds seriously. So we compiled an archive of journalistic articles, academic articles, political speeches, and more in order to analyze the way in which fake news, post-truth, and so forth is being presented to us and its relation to democracy. So we ask, how is society imagined to be in a crisis in these discourses? What are presented as solutions and what visions for democracy do they contain? And the reason we call them post-truth worlds is that we're not just talking about rhetoric here. As will become clear in my talk today, this has very material consequences. This has implications for the laws that are currently being implemented across the world, the kind of technologies that are being developed. So we are both talking about the way we talk about post-truth, fake news, but we are also very much analyzing what are the material consequences of the way in which we present this. And so, if anyone needs to leave early, you can get the key arguments up front, and then I will expand a bit on them. So the main arguments of our book are that we find that discourses around fake news, post-truth, and the infodemic tend to one-sidedly equate democracy with truth. Furthermore, they tend to equate fake news to a virus or disease, which neglect its deeply political nature. Doing so, they also neglect the complicated history of democracy and the democratic tradition, which has never just been about truth, but of course been about popular sovereignty, egalitarianism, and participation. Also doing so, they tend to legitimize anti-democratic laws and measures in the name of saving democracy. And finally, this will not do. This is our critique, that yes, our democracies, liberal democracies, are in a crisis, as multiple scholars have argued and documented. But to say that it is a sudden crisis of truth misses the point. And not only that, it risks worsening the current problems, because often, as will become clear in this talk, we see that solutions presented revolve around restricting people's ability to participate in democratic debate and democratic decision making. So let me give a few examples of what I mean, and how these discourses are both how it's articulated rhetorically, but also the consequences. So I want to give 3 quotes. They're from 3 different countries, and what you can do wherever you are at, home or uni, or is to try to guess whether this quote derives from a country with a high degree of press freedom and freedom of speech, or one with less so. So we start with the first quote here. Freedom of expression and press freedom are the cornerstones of an open and free society. Nevertheless, freedom of expression ends at the point where criminal law begins. Criminally punishable hate speech and lies should have as little place in social media as in every other area of society. So this was said by the German government in 2017 as legitimacy, as a way of legitimizing their law called NetzDG, which requires social media companies to remove illegal content by German law within 24 hours or face fines of up to 50 million euros. This law was criticized for privatizing key legal decisions in Germany, and also Reporters Without Borders called it a model for non-democratic states to limit internet debate. But if we look at press freedom and freedom of speech in Germany, I will use Reporters Without Borders, their yearly ranking. And here in 2023, we find that Germany was ranked 21st out of 180 countries in terms of press freedom. That brings me to the second quote. The working of a democratic society depends on the members of that society being informed and not misinformed. Misleading people, purveying as fact statements which are not true, is destructive of the democratic society. So this was said in Singapore in 2019, and as you can see, we've moved down the list quite a bit in terms of press freedom. So this was said in connection to a law in Singapore that was introduced, which requires online media platforms to remove content that the government considers to be false, and penalizes people who spread false information with potential prison terms of up to 10 years. This was, of course, also criticized by human rights groups. And then finally, the third quote, one can hardly agree with the opinion that this is some sort of censorship. this sphere, the sphere of fake news, insults, and so on, is under strict regulation in many countries of the world, even in European states. This undoubtedly has to be done in our country. And as some might guess, others not, this was said in Russia in 2019. We've moved even further down the list, down to number 164 out of 180 countries in terms of press freedom. And this was said as a way of legitimizing their anti-fake news law, which penalizes people who spread fake news with fines of up to 1.5 million rubles. But even further, in 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine, they tightened their anti-fake news laws. So now it can give prison sentences of up to 15 years for those who knowingly spread what the government considers to be false information. So we have 3 different countries, varying degrees of press freedom, to say the least. But what is interesting here is that we both find laws as a key solutions presented in different forms, but we also find a similar kind of narrative despite the differences. And this is generally what we find in our book, that across these different post-truth worlds, across geopolitical boundaries, while there are quite different political forces at play, the narratives are often similar. The narrative goes something like this: society is experiencing a sudden crisis. This crisis is caused by the demise of truth. This demise is intimately linked to technological change, and thus we need to do something fast. We need to do something radical. And this legitimizes, for example, censorship, which otherwise we would not. Furthermore, another thing that is common between these 3 quotes and common across these discourses is what we call fake news as a floating signifier. That fake news has become this term that is defined opposingly within different geopolitical contexts, within different discourses. And we draw on discourse theory here, the work of Laclau and Mouffe, to make this argument. And what is important to stress here is that we're not just saying that it's a vague term. There are plenty of vague terms out in the world, and fake news can also be vague, certainly. So can infodemic and disinformation be used politically. But what is interesting and worrying about this is that it is defined opposingly within different discourses. So if we ask your president, I was about to say, your incoming President Trump, what is fake news? We can all imagine what he would say, right? It might be a vague answer, but it could also be a quite clear one. It's CNN, it's the New York Times, it's the specific outlets that he does not like within what he defines as mainstream media, right? And we can also imagine that if Trump had got even more power and had kind of total control over this discourse, it could become settled what fake news is, right? Which is a worrying thought, is our argument, right? But it is important to keep in mind, because every time these legal solutions are presented, this is often neglected. It is presented as if we can, in our country, come up with a very clear definition which will not be politicized. But fake news, ever since it exploded into popular discourse in 2016, it has been politicized. And that is not just a matter of Donald Trump, who has, of course, made it a catchphrase of his, but we see it across the world that political leaders use this narrative of a sudden crisis of fake news to legitimize new forms of legislation. And a famous example of this came in 2018 when President Macron, the French president, visited the US and gave a speech to the US Congress about the dangers of fake news for democracy. After this speech, Washington Post wrote this headline: French President Macron said fake news and everyone heard their own definition. So we can imagine it, right? Across the aisle, Republicans and Democrats nodding to this message, but that's of course only because they have completely opposite ideas of what we are talking about in the first place, right? Another thing that was central about this speech from Macron, which we also spend time on in the book, is that it very clearly made this link of democracy being equal to truth and our current problems arising from the fact that truth is under pressure. So as you said, to protect our democracies, we have to fight against the ever-growing virus of fake news, which exposes our people to irrational fear and imaginary risk. Without reason, without truth, there is no real democracy, because democracy is about true choices and rational decisions. The corruption of information is an attempt to corrode the very spirit of our democracies. And besides really capturing this overarching narrative that we find in our analysis, it also contained this important argument, right? That fake news is equal to a virus or can be understood as a virus. And this was said before COVID-19, interestingly, right? So we had fake news as a virus before everyone was talking about the COVID-19. But of course, then COVID-19 came along, and this narrative of the virus became even stronger. So here we have it, the information virus. And I want to read a short passage from our book about why we think this this notion of fake news as a virus is more than just a figurative use of language. Medical analogies are not mere metaphors or representations, and their use are far from accidental. Instead, they constitute the discursive backbone of the democratic imaginary currently conjured up in scholarly, journalistic, and political discourses, highlighting the network structure of present-day false information. Often, the medical vocabulary invoked to capture fake news and the post-truth era present these phenomena as simultaneously cultural and larger than life. On the one hand, fake news is caused by specific bad actors spreading chaos and destruction in societies from within. In this sense, it has a deeply human and cultural cause, namely malicious individuals and groups who distort reality for personal, economic, or political gains. Yet, on the other hand, post-truth and fake news are also claimed to be biological, intravenous, viral, and infectious. They are, in other words, constructed as being larger than life, beyond the cultural and human domain. This uncanny blend of culturalism and naturalism, portraying post-truth as both human and more than human, is one of the guiding tensions in post-truth worlds. Despite the seeming contradiction between the two, they often coexist quite neatly within these worlds, allowing for continuous displacement of cause and effect. At certain times, particular groups, institutions, or fields can be blamed for this viral disease, drawing on a culturalist register, while at other times, blame can be given to fake news or post-truth in themselves, as if these could be understood apart from their specific human contexts and mobilizations, drawing on a naturalist register. So what we often find is that this virus metaphor depoliticizes the problem in the sense that it becomes something that has a life on its own, and also that becomes easier to legitimize, for example, trying to remove through legislation. Who can be against fixing the plague or stopping the virus? Which of course neglects that we are dealing with humans sharing information, sharing political opinions, and so forth. And neglecting how, again, fake news as a floating signifier can easily be used by politicians in a specific country to impose their definition of fake news. But this virus, as I already mentioned, This virus metaphor grew even stronger when COVID-19 hit, and we were also introduced to a new term, namely the notion of the infodemic. So in mid-February 2020, Tedros Ghebreyesus, director of the WHO, spoke on the dangers of COVID-19. And here he warned about the infodemic. As he claimed, we're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. Fake news spreads faster and more easily than this virus and is just as dangerous. And following this, scholars also picked up on this notion of both the infodemic and the virus, also when trying to come up with ideas of how to fight it. So we saw, for example, ideas of inoculation, a vaccination of this infodemic, but also we saw, as this quote exemplifies, the idea of silencing certain groups to stop this infodemic being legitimized also by scholars. And governments picked up on this as well. As documented by Human Rights Watch, at least 83 governments used the COVID-19 pandemic to justify legal restrictions on free speech and political gatherings. So we can see how the virus metaphor does more than just paint a picture. It also frames solutions in a specific way, and one which, in our view, has some fundamental flaws and problems. And across these post-truth worlds, besides these kind of laws, what we find is that there is a lot of moralizing, condemning. There are these ideas of policing the truth through laws, and also police task forces and these kind of things. There's a lot of technological solutionism, the notion that we should have a truth algorithm, or as Elon Musk has said, a truth GPT. And then finally, the notion of re-establishing centers of truth-making. We need to re-establish trust in journalism and in science, and also kind of go back to the days where these institutions really mattered and really could tell us what was true. But as I've already hinted at, we see some major problems with these solutions, and this is a key point for us, that these solutions, in our view, do not just fail to address a number of fundamental issues that are facing democracies, but also potentially could make them worse. So let's go through 5 problems that we highlight in our book. So first, and perhaps most obvious, we never had a truth era, right? I think all of us kind of intuitively know this, but nevertheless, I think it's important to state, right? And we think it's important to state. And one article that inspired us a lot on this is one by Robert Magia and colleagues called A Racial History of Post-Truth, in which they write, it is troubling to suggest that them being based in the US, that we now live in a post-truth era when our history includes the 3/5 compromise, ongoing segregation, uneven drug policies, and other atrocities. So in a US context, we could ask, when do we wanna, what is the ideal period we wanna highlight as the golden era here, right? Was it, going back, we quickly find a time where journalism was even more white and elite, and segregation was a thing even more, right? Even encoded in law and so forth. And we also, of course, go further back, women couldn't vote and so forth, right? So there is this real danger of being nostalgic about a truth era that just never existed, right? And there is something paradoxical and but also interesting about post-truth being quite often expressed. The notion that we live in a post-truth era is often expressed by people who are highly critical of someone like Trump. But while Trump in 2016 in his presidential campaign said, "Make America Great Again," post-truth also contains a similar kind of nostalgia for a golden era that, of course, never existed. So even though they are kind of opposites, there is a problematic nostalgia in both. So that's the first issue. That's the historical problem, that we never had a post-truth, that we never had a truth era. But another historical problem is that if we look at indicators for democracy, it is certainly the case that that there are a lot of crisis, signs of crisis across liberal democracies, including in the US, or perhaps very much in the US, we could also say. So, for example, if we look at trust in the US, as here measured by Pew Research, yes, trust in the government is very low in the US. Major issue, right? In any society, and especially a democratic one. But there is no suddenness to this, right? It's not that it was going very well and then social media came, or now AI, and suddenly trust has been plummeting. Trust has been falling for decades and has been quite low for decades as well, right? So we cannot just call this sudden, and we cannot just call it technological. The same goes for electoral participation across the world. Global voter turnout has declined also for decades, especially in Europe. But we cannot blame that on these past few years, right? And the causality is probably more the other way, right? That it is exactly this decade-old problem of declining trust, declining voter participation that gives rise to many of the problems we see on social media. And that leads me to the third problem, that our crisis does not seem to be primarily about truth. So we draw in our book on a number of critical political theorists, including Chantal Mouffe, Jacques Rancière, Wendy Brown, Wolfgang Streeck, and Colin Crouch. And they have all argued for quite a number of years that liberal democracy is facing across the world, are facing major problems. But they have pointed to radically different causes than a sudden collapse of truth. We have growing inequality, we have increasing role of money in politics, we're having an increasing distance between politicians and citizens, and a declining participation in grassroots politics, membership of parties and unions and so forth. There is increasing concentration of ownership in media, and also the death of local journalism, especially in the US. And this growing sense that politics increasingly revolves around managing the status quo of hard economic necessities. A lack of visions in politics, we could also say, right? And so by making this primarily about truth and primarily about fixing a sudden problem, we might both ignore the politicians both ignore these factors, but also could potentially actually make them worse, right? And this is then the more philosophical argument, you could say, that drawing on these critical political philosophers, it's also important for us to say that democracy has never just been about truth. And we could go even further and say democracy has never primarily been about truth, right? So the etymology of democracy is, of course, demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning rule, right? Rule by the people. And so core democratic ideals are egalitarianism, participation, democratic decision-making, and of course, truth has, and agreeing on truth has always been an important factor in functioning democracies and functioning societies. But to make this all about, or primarily about, truth risks ignoring the foundation of the democratic tradition altogether. Because democracy needs disagreement to function. It needs strong institutions that can facilitate that disagreement, right? To make sure that we respect certain foundational rules in terms of respecting human rights and respecting each other's ability to express ourselves and form new coalitions and so forth, but at the same time also facilitating disagreement, facilitating that different groups can try to present the case for their interests and their vision of how we ought to live together, how we could live together, different visions for how we want to live together. And in a lot of these narratives about post-truth, we find calls for limiting disagreement, limiting this kind of space of people presenting new visions for how we want to live together, and potentially even eliminating the possibility of people expressing themselves and forming a political opposition party altogether, right? As is the case, for example, in Russia. So this is where, to step into the virus metaphor, this is where the cure for us seems more like part of the disease, or more as a poison, more like the bloodletting performed on George Washington back in 1799. And so I want to read here towards the very end of my talk, and I very much look forward to discussing it, read a short passage from our book that tries to summarize these problems I've tried to highlight here. Post-truth worlds presuppose that democracy is at its core bound to truth, evidence, and rational dialogue, and that expert judgments and hard economic necessities have to rule over popular dispute for democracy to function. As a consequence, post-truth worlds tend to suggest that the crisis of democracy is not only sudden, but that it is first and foremost due to a waning capacity for engaging in consensus-based dialogue and respecting expert-led decision-making. We want to suggest that the current democratic crisis is in fact neither sudden nor linked to issues of factuality or reason alone. More fundamentally, what is at stake is a crisis of democracy, caused by the increasingly pervasive dismantlement of proper democratic institutions, popular sovereignty, and political participation. So I want to end with this difficult but also very important question, which is the question that we try to raise with our book. To say we need to think bigger than just talking about disinformation and truth. We need to talk about how we can reinvigorate and strengthen the democratic tradition and expand the democratic tradition, make our societies more pluralistic and egalitarian in a digital era where, of course, the digital space has increasingly become dominated by monopolistic corporations with these profit incentives, right? And we need to have a broader discussion about how could digital media, digital technologies also better support democratic participation, involvement in democratic decision-making, and the formation of political alternatives. And again, highlighting that the role of democratic institutions should exactly be to facilitate this and not to ignore popular demands. So with that, I will say thank you so much for your time, and I really look forward to discussing it with you.
Great, thank you so much, Johan. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A box right now, but folks, I welcome you all to put any questions or thoughts there, and we'll try to make our way through the list. So first sort of observation, and maybe something you can approach from Brendan, who's sharing appreciation for your work and analysis. and is wondering if there may be value in engaging in democratic efforts to collective sense-making rather than trying to determine some elusive objective truth. Deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies seem to provide some hope in this area.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think that those are exactly along the lines of what we try to encourage, right? It's not that we see us as academics either as those who will be able to deliver those answers as to how we want to create a more democratic digital society. But I think these are exactly the types of thinking we need to have and type of discussions that I feel sadly that scholars have not had enough these past years, in part because, again, this kind of narrative of the sudden crisis has captured many different parts of society. But I think I think it is a good point to highlight that, yes, of course, we having some kind of shared understanding of the world is important, but at the same time, we don't need agreement all the time. We need to be able to foster a form of democratic participation where exactly it is allowed to disagree, but of course not in a way where we want to eliminate the opponent, but where we disagree in our visions for the future, not in terms of course, whether people are allowed to participate at all.
Great. So next question, apologize if I'm about to say your name incorrectly. Marzai is asking, isn't the perception of fake news often shaped by the political bias of news agencies or the parties they support? What steps can be taken to address fake news, especially during times of crisis, to ensure accurate information is shared and separate genuine misinformation from partisan perspectives?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, that's a very good and also difficult question or questions. So in terms of the latter, I think in times of crisis, first of all, like history tells us that times of crisis will always be the moments where we are most at risk, like because there are over here so many people who want to know stuff and very little information yet out there, right? And that will create a situation where there will be misleading claims, right? But I think right now, of course, what we have
Shelby, did Johan freeze for you as well?
Yes. Stand by, everyone.
Hey
Hi,
again.
Johan.
Yeah, I don't know what happened, but yeah, to try to pick up on the question again. Like I think first of all there is no way that we will not have this problem during crisis moments. But structurally, I think what the discussion we need to have is about how people get, what are the infrastructures of getting information and having public debates, right? And for example, in Denmark, from where I'm speaking right now here in Copenhagen, in Denmark, we have a very strong tradition of public service media and also state support for commercial newspapers, which are quite political in a sense. They're not party presses, but there are clear political differences between the different newspapers, but they do also share these basic, of course, basic kind of rules and norms. But I think like this is especially in a European context where we have this tradition of public service. I think this is a debate we need to be having. Like, what would a public service social media platform look like? And especially in times of crisis, is it really functional that engagement is the key metric that drives information sharing. So we have some fundamental structural problems with our information ecosystem. Yeah, but in terms of the second part, very briefly, this notion of bias, I'm not a big fan of the word, because bias also has this kind of implicit assumption of the unbiased, of the non-cultural view on the world, right? And I think, again, the problem is not that newspapers shouldn't be politically aligned. I think that's good in a democracy, that there are differences in terms of what kind of certain groups will follow a newspaper and also use it to build certain ideas out in terms of how we want to live together, right? And I think, again, that is a core feature of democracy, not a problem. So this notion that we need to find the unbiased algorithm or the unbiased newspaper, of course, we should talk about this like racism produced by algorithms. That's a very real problem. And also in journalism, that too many journalists compared to the population in most liberal democracies are white dudes. So I think, like, obviously there are structural issues also in terms of representation, but this notion of bias, I think, is it's not my favorite.
Okay, we have a question from Thomas. I kind of want to link back to you talking about Denmark a little. Is there a correlation between level of democracy and production of misinformation, disinformation? And would a ranking of national inequality match fake news production, assuming such a thing could be measured?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I mean, there have been attempts at ranking countries based on how vulnerable they are to mis and disinformation. And there, for example, the Nordic countries rank among the highest. They also rank among the highest in terms of press freedom and trust in the press. So I mean, we do have a sense structurally of what already kind of works in some ways, right? Of course, we should always be careful about generalizing from especially these small Nordic countries that have their particular tradition, right? So it's not like any attempt at saying, oh, we should just do like we do here in Denmark. Not at all. But I do think, like, having real thought put into how to build out the information system and not just letting it be a market issue, I think, is an important factor. And that is something that has historically been important in a country like Denmark, and still is so. And of course, that needs to be implemented with a clear distance between politicians and journalists, or between politicians and whatever could be a public service social media platform, right? And that is of course a tricky part. And especially, I know in the US, you guys are very very low trust in terms of government, right? We just saw it on the slide. So yeah, it's definitely not an easy thing to rebuild that kind of trust, right? But I think these are the kind of debates we need to be having, like what could a more sustainable information ecosystem look like, and how can the state perhaps also contribute through funding of certain forms of initiatives that are not just about removing the bad stuff, but about, like, creating forums for also letting different political groups, for example, express their ideas for society. So what struck me during your recent presidential elections is, I followed, of course, the media a lot on both candidates, and I was never really, I did not get very wise on what they actually want to do specifically, right? And I think, and of course, that is a key problem, because journalism, they only had one debate famously, right? A historic low number of debates, which normally would be a chance where journalists could ask these kind of questions. But instead, they go on podcasts and tweet, and all. It's not called tweeting anymore, according to Elon. But so I think, like, the information ecosystem has changed, and we need to talk about how how to make it function better. And that's not just a matter of reducing the bad stuff, the disinformation, but more about like, how could we actually make it more democratic, use it as a way for people to be able to not only express themselves, but also be involved in building political platforms and decision making.
We have a question from Yasmin. I think potentially building off of that question a little, do you have any proposed solutions for truth in our current digital era? For example, the rise of podcasting influencing the recent US election, or the lightning speed growth of generative AI?
Yeah, so I think like I guess my kind of the provocation back would in terms of answer would be to say, I think if the US fixed the income inequality and fixed like these structural problems in terms of also the kind of problems of gerrymandering and money in politics, and like there are a lot of structural things that has nothing to do with technology, which are quite foundational here in terms of why the political landscape and media landscape is how it is, right? But then at the same time, if we talk about technology, I think again the too much emphasis is placed on discussing how we reduce bad stuff, and too little emphasis is on how we build, how we support building technologies that can support democratic decision making again. Because again, too often we also just talk about it as if it's about debate. Like, as long as there's a lot of debate out there and people can post, and then we're good, right? But I think democracy is of course not just about talking. Talking is important, but it is also about getting involved somehow. And it used to be, of course, across liberal democracies, that every political party had a huge base of citizens who were members of the party and so forth, right? And actually had an impact on the local elections. And of course, that is still happening, but it is not happening to the same extent. Unions were another place, and different kind of volunteer organizations and so forth, right? I think again, speaking of from a Danish context, we have like every Dane is a member of multiple of these kind of volunteer organizations, whether it's where you live and so forth, right? And they are structured typically democratically, right? There needs to be a yearly meeting and so forth. And I think it's important to highlight that that's also democracy, and that's a core part of where democracy starts. It's not just every 4 years during elections. So it is a difficult one to talk about how could that be supported better digitally. But we are facing clear problems, of course, with, for example, generative AI and the abilities that has in terms of creating disinformation, and also people trusting it too much and it not being able to tell you when it's correct or not, and bullshitting. But yeah, so it's not that we have a lot of problems at hand for sure, but I do think this is the moment for us to talk about these big picture issues of how could we actually build an alternative.
I think that goes into a couple questions we have here. One from an anonymous attendee. Numerous researchers have suggested that overcoming mis and disinformation and conspiracy theories with facts has generally proven ineffective, and lasting resolution involves much deeper prescriptions and tools. I was wondering if you could provide your thoughts on this issue and prescriptions/tools that you might deem most effective. What role might tech itself serve in countering non-truth?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about the issue of disinformation and solutions, the first thing we need to do is to talk about what specific type and context are we talking about. Because, so let's take, for example, the use of fake accounts on social media by states to try to influence political debates in other states. That is a big issue in the 21st century. But that has little to do with like helping people, teaching people how to spot fake stuff. So I've done studies myself of the Russian Internet Research Agency, and those accounts that we've studied on what was then called Twitter, there would be nothing to spot for us in that case. Like, they were well made and they claimed to be US citizens, of course, but they also didn't spread much disinformation. The disinformation, of course, was creating a fake persona, but then they would infiltrate the Black Lives Matter movement, Trump supporters, and then try to boost certain messages and opinions, right? And that is a key democratic problem. In that case, I think it is more about diplomacy, because now it has turned out that during COVID, the US engaged in the use of disinformation in the Philippines to spread disinformation about the Chinese vaccine. So I think like we are seeing a kind of Cold War style arms race in terms of these capabilities. But I think that is on a government level, and of course citizens asking politicians to, we need some kind of UN resolution on you guys not doing that. Stop doing that. I mean, so that's one thing, for example. But again, in others, when it comes to anti-vax disinformation, there are different groups in society that have historic reasons for mistrusting health authorities, right, in different contexts. And so I think often, instead of talking about it as one big issue, we do need to talk about the specifics here, about like how can, for example, if there is a specific demographic or area where people distrust health authorities, what can be done in that context, right? And of course, yeah, so again, making it this large scale and more or less apolitical issue that can be fixed technologically, I'm quite skeptical towards. And I think in terms of what tech giants can do, I think it's more about like, how can tech giants be regulated? I know that's a very European thing to say, but there are so many incentives for the tech companies not to reveal necessarily exactly when something is being compromised. Or, I mean, I think if 2016 taught these tech giants anything, it's that these kind of cases, when they are revealed, such as Russian use of social media accounts in US political debates, then that's a big PR crisis. So if we can avoid that, what we saw, of course, was that Facebook closed its APIs since Elon Musk took over. X has closed APIs, and CrowdTangle has been closed. All these tools that researchers also used before to actually track what is going on. And of course, the official story is that this is because it could be misused. But at the same time, like what I would say it's more about is trying to reduce the likelihood that if such a thing happens again, we will find out, right? And I think especially outside the US, maybe in the US, because they are based there, these tech giants, it will come to light what if it happens again. Let's see. But I think especially if it happens in what happens in Malaysia or in Singapore or like or in the Philippines. I mean, these then I'm not sure we would be right. And I think, of course, it is deeply troubling that, for example, the U.S. Government seems to have engaged in this kind of activity also.
So I think it's a sign of what a great discussion this has been, that there are, I think, at least 8 more questions that we've run out of time for. Johan, I want to thank you for your time. Hopefully people can reach out to you. You do have your own website, and I saw you're on Blue Sky and a few other services as well. So I hope the conversation can continue in other formats, but I'm very grateful for you for joining, and Shelby for moderating. Shelby is going to play us out with some information about how to follow us and be a part of future speaker series and so forth. But thank you again, Johan.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for joining us. I put some information in the chat as well, where you can follow the Institute for Rebooting Social Media and the Applied Social Media Lab on X and Instagram. I've also left our website where you can sign up for newsletters, and we should be announcing new events for the spring in the next couple of months. So stay tuned for that. And thank you all again for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.